So I'm starting a little early so I can try to figure out how to view comments, because last time whenever I got on, I wasn't able to see any of the comments. So I'm logging into like my phone and my computer in a couple different ways to see how this works. All right. Oh, good. Okay, I'm starting to see them a little bit better today. So hopefully that'll keep working. I'm gonna do something else real quick. Okay. And I have an outline here in front of me as well. So hopefully it won't be too annoying when I look down at the paper here and there. All right, I see a lot of people starting to join. If people are gonna watch this video later, right now it's about 4 minutes until we start, so you could skip ahead if you want in the video a couple minutes to where this starts. But people who are joining, thank you again for checking in live. If you have questions, you can start to ask them right now. But as we go along, you can also ask some questions. I don't know if I'll get to everybody's live, but I'll try. And if I don't get to them live, then I'll definitely look back afterwards and then find questions and in the comments post responses as much as I can to your questions. And if there's any issues ever with audio or video, let me know. Hopefully we don't have an internet issue like last time. I'm trying to monitor that also. So hopefully we won't have any type of hiccups this time. All right, so I see a lot of people continue to jump in, so that's good. Okay, good. I'm seeing Janice saying hi. That's good. Okay, so I think I'm seeing the comments this time. Last time it was really weird. I couldn't see anything going on, and then afterwards I looked and saw all these comments. So it was awesome to see them afterwards, but hopefully this time I'll be able to keep up with them a little bit more live. All right, so hello to, so it looks like my sister Erin is here, and then Wes, Jesselyn, Melanie. Anne Marie says hi, and then David and Mimi. Oh, thank you, Mimi. She skipped dinner. Well, you can definitely eat while you're watching if you want, but I'm going to give definitely a couple more minutes as other people jump in. So Trenton and Teresa. I don't know if both Trenton and Teresa are here, but happy Advent as well. Jesselyn saying happy Advent. So this is definitely kind of tricky. It's my first time really trying to talk and keep up with the comments, so hopefully it'll go okay. Okay, so this is all like a new thing, as I said, but someone, looks like Diana commented on my video also, but it popped up in a different way. I don't know, Facebook's kind of weird, I'll have to say. I'm not sure how this all works. Okay, good. Dinah says she's behind, but checking in with everything, so that's great. And we have Julie and Greg and Jeremy joining, so that's good to have everybody. Oh, good. All right, so both of y'all. Oh, and Jim Boland's here. Hello to him. So it's about 8 o'clock. I don't want to keep everybody too much this evening, so I want to kind of be prompt with getting started. People may jump in as we go, and that's perfectly fine. This video will be posted and on the group page later. So I'm getting Emily's posting that something at the same time. All right, I'm gonna turn my phone off because it looks like it's chiming in different things. So, all right. So I'm gonna go ahead and get started. And basically my goal today is to summarize the chapter. And this may be a review for people who've read the chapter and finished, but just because I know there's a different group of people here, some are reading the book, some are getting behind, some may be reading and not understanding it. So I'm gonna summarize things, but for people who are kind of caught up and maybe even ahead of other people, hopefully I'll also add in some things that you can actually learn from, some key elements and aspects, kind of digging a little deeper than what Frank Sheed is getting into. So hopefully I'll be able to help everybody, no matter where you're at in this whole reading process, learn a little something after tonight. So the summary hopefully will be a review for some, and then for those who are trying to keep up and maybe even kind of a little confused by what's happening, hopefully the summary will be helpful. All right, and Virginia's with us. Okay, so I'm going to get started. So first I want to thank everybody for being a part of the group. I think it was kind of surprising to me how many people were interested, and then and surprising how many people have jumped in and got the book and started reading. So first, thank you, and hopefully hopefully not too many people are overwhelmed. I know the book is challenging, and someone asked today, why I had selected this book. And on the group page, I mentioned a little summary as to why, but a lot of it's because I like Frank Sheed's writing. He wrote this in 1933, so it's an older style. So it takes a little getting used to with the way he writes, but I think he gives so much depth and light to the faith that I just felt like it might be a good book for us to jump in on. Plus, I wanted to talk about theology, but a lot of times when you find books about theology, they spend a lot of time on the doctrines, which is a great thing. So it's delving into, what do we mean by the Trinity? What do we mean by the incarnation? And those truths are important. We do need to delve into those and study and learn those deeply. But what I like about this book, for almost kind of like a beginner's book, is that he first gives an overview. And like the book says, it's called a map of life, because what he wants to do is show us a map, give us this overall big picture of things. And at the same time, he will go into some doctrines and some teachings, but he wants to make sure we see who we are and where we're going and why we're here and why it is that a relationship with God is so important. And so I think that's kind of why this book was attractive to me as maybe something to begin with, is before we get into any more depth with some of these theological points and doctrines of the faith, just making sure we kind of get going on the right foot, where we kind of see almost like the forest. We're not just focusing on individual trees. We're seeing the forest first. But I think if you hang in there, this book hopefully in the end will be rewarding. And as you go along, the chapters will get easier, I think. You'll get used to his writing style. Plus, he's going to start talking about some topics you're familiar with. And I think that'll help a little bit too. But chapter 1 and even chapter 2, I think they're a little challenging because you're getting used to his writing style, but also he presents an idea that's not new, but he's presenting it in a new way. So it can take some time to figure out, what he's saying. But I think once you do, it can be rewarding, and hopefully you'll feel that way as well. All right. So before I keep going, looks like there's a couple of questions. I know Sally is asking, how does she connect? I'm not sure if it's just a matter of talking to me that I can see your question, but I'm not sure what other questions are. But I can see Sally posting your comment, and Paul and Emily. And Lisa, I can see everybody has jumped in and joined. So I'm trying to keep up with comments and questions as we go. So I may take breaks here and there to look to the sidebar where I can see these. But if you have questions or comments, you can post them. All right, so that was a little introduction as to why I picked the book. Now let's jump into the book, just so that I can try to get through this and not take too much of your time. In the introduction, Frank Sheed presents a very brief summary of the purpose of his book. And it really just fits with the title, The Map of Life. And as I just mentioned a minute ago, why I chose the book is because he's trying to show us where we're going, and then he's trying to show us what the path is to get there. So what is our purpose? What is the goal of our life? And then how do we fulfill that? And what has God given us to help us do that? And so that's kind of the purpose of the book that he talks about in the introduction. And then in chapter 1, he's going to jump in. And the first thing he's going to talk about, and this chapter is so deep, so I'm going to try to summarize things. I won't get to every point, but I'm going to try to hit some of the highlights. But the thing really that he's going to argue above anything else is how important it is that we know what our purpose is. And if we don't know that, then we have a very weak foundation, and it's going to collapse. So we need to know who we are and what we were made for. And this is because the value and the goodness of all of our decisions and actions and the way of life that we live it's essential to knowing the purpose in order to live rightly and to make good decisions. So that's where he's going to go with chapter 1. Let me check one thing before I keep going. So I'm going to try to see, because I don't want to. Hopefully, if I start losing internet, y'all can just start adding comments. Hopefully, I'll see them this time. Last time, I just did not see them. Okay. Sorry, I was a little discombobulated at first. I'm trying to figure out how to do this best. Okay, so the first question I want to talk about that he discusses is what is man and who is man? And what he talks about is that man is a very unique creature among God's creation. He talks about how God made several different things. When we look at all creation, if we want to kind of lump them into groups, he made non-living beings, but that are made of matter. So like a rock. A rock is made of matter. It's a material thing, but it's not living. But then God also made other forms of matter, of material things that are living beings, like a tree or like a dog. And they're distinct from a human being, but they're pure matter. So we have rocks that are pure matter that are non-living, and we have animals or trees that are pure matter, but they're living beings. But then, even higher than that, God made angels. Angels are pure spirit. They do not have matter. They don't have physical bodies like we do. And so God made a pure spirit, pure spiritual beings called the angels. And then almost linking these two types of creatures that he made, pure matter with pure spirit, God makes human beings. And human beings are a composite of that. They're a composite of spirit and of matter. And that's why as human beings, by definition, we have a body and a soul. And so he starts by talking about that, how it's important to realize that human beings, what makes us a human being is that we have a body and we have a soul. And our body is physical. It's the material element in who we are. And then the soul is the spirit, the spiritual element in who we are. And then the body and the soul united makes up a human person. And what we'll learn is the soul is immortal and the body can corrupt and decay, but it's essential that the body and soul go together. That's what makes up a human being. A soul without the body, we'll talk about it in a minute, it still continues to exist, but it knows it's missing something. It knows it's missing the body. When it comes to human beings. So we'll come back to talking about the soul here in a minute. But he goes into why it's so important to recognize who we are as human beings, because if we get this wrong, it can be devastating. It looks like Sally is having some issues. I can see her comments, but I'm not sure why. She's having some trouble seeing the video, so I don't know if anyone can maybe help her with that, but hopefully she'll be able to maybe reboot and connect. I'll just tell her, yeah, okay, good, Mimi, thanks for helping her. That's what I would say, is maybe reboot and get back on. So one of the things that he talks about, I'm going to get a little teaching board. I'm not really good with small talk, but whenever I try to do these things, it just It's kind of just most natural to me to start trying to teach a little bit. So hopefully that's okay. I brought a little whiteboard to kind of help. So one of the things that that we need to understand is if we don't understand what a human person is, that we're composed of a body and a soul, and that's what makes us who we are, then it can have devastating consequences. And we see this if we look back over the past 2,000 years. There was a heresy called dualism. Dualism in the early church, they dealt with this. Dualism is this view that there's two gods, and what they hold is that there's one God who's good, who created the pure spiritual world, and then there's another God who's evil. They call him the demiurge, but the evil God created matter. And so what the evil God does is he entraps souls in bodies. And so what the dualists, people who held to dualism, believed was that the human body was like a prison for the soul. And the purpose of life was for the soul to escape the body. And so they saw the body as evil. And so it's a very dangerous heresy. And over the past 2,000 years, you'll see it cropping up at different times throughout the church's history. There was a group called the Manichaeans, and St. Augustine, he fell into this heresy for a time before he converted and became Catholic. He fell into the Manichaeans. I'll write that name for you if you're interested. But the Manichaeans also held to this dualistic idea, the Manichaeans. And then in sometime around, I think it was around 1100, 1200 AD, there were a couple other groups called the Albigensians and then the Cathars. These two groups also held these dualistic ideas, Albigensians and Cathars. So the problem is whenever they held to this view of that the body is evil, then they started to have worldviews that were very dangerous. They hated the idea of procreation and the idea of creating children, because what they thought was that the result of procreation was that you're entrapping a soul into the body. So you're creating this prison. And so they saw procreation as abominable, and they made intercourse within marriage unlawful because they did not want people creating children. They also commended suicide because they saw that it was a way to free the soul from the body. And so these views are so dangerous. But again, it's this dualistic idea that the body is evil and the soul is good, and that within this world here on earth, we're in this battle for the soul to escape the body. And so it's dangerous. And that's what Frank Sheet is trying to get at, is that we have to first understand what we mean by who man is. Because if we even get that wrong, it can lead to dangerous problems like we've seen for 2,000 years. Okay, so that's the idea of just who man is, that we're human beings composed of body and a soul, and both are good. God created the body good and he created the soul good, and he created these things good. The next aspect of understanding the human person is understanding that the soul is the life-giving principle of the body. And so whenever the moment of conception, whenever the body is created, God infuses the soul into the body, and the soul gives the body life. And so we call the soul a life-giving principle. And the soul is what gives the body the power to think and to reason and to have memories. And so that's how come the church defines death as the separation of body and soul. So whenever you die, the soul separates from the body. So now the body no longer has that life-giving principle. So the body decays and corrupts, and the soul will continue to live because the soul is immortal. And so God, in his plan for creation, created the human soul so that it would live. Once it was created, it would live eternally. It would live infinitely. There was no end to life once that soul was created. And so at death, the body and the soul separate. The soul continues to exist, so the soul continues to have its memory. It continues to be able to think and to love. But the soul knows that it's incomplete without the body, because the human person, like I said, is a body-soul composite. As the soul lives, it knows that it's still lacking a part of itself, and so it knows it's without the body. But God has told us, he's promised that on the last day the body will be resurrected, and the soul and the body will be reunited. And we'll talk more about that later in the book, but we will have a resurrection of the body in the last day, and the soul and the body will be reunited. And so the soul is even in heaven. Even right now, they know they're lacking the body, and they kind of await that day. They're happy. They're not at all sad being in heaven. You know, in heaven there's no tears, there's no sadness. It's pure joy. They still know that they're awaiting that last day when they'll be reunited with the body. And so that's another point that he makes in this first part of the chapter, is just understanding that we're a body-soul composite, and understanding what the soul is to the body. Then the next thing, probably the key part of this chapter, is just when he talks about what is the purpose of man's life. What's the purpose of man's life? Hopefully we're still good on here, and everyone hopefully is still getting some connections. And thanks, Mimi, for helping Sally. Hopefully Sally's able to figure out how to connect. I'm not sure what's happening. But the key part of this passage is, what is the purpose of man's life? And that's what we're going to spend the next little bit on, is just going over what Frank Sheets says about this. And he just says that it's so important, it's so critical for us to understand, what man is, but then beyond that, what is the purpose? What is man for? And he says it's really important that if you have a created thing, if you have a creature, you can look at it and you can analyze it, and science can analyze it to determine what is it made of, and you might even be able to try to figure out, all the elements, the protons, the neutrons. You can get as scientific as you want to look at the material elements, the material aspects of a creature, but you still may misunderstand what that thing is for. And as we talked about in the comments, a lot of people liked that analogy of the razor that he gave in the book. And so you have this idea of a man comes upon a razor, and he doesn't realize it's for cutting his beard. He thinks it's for cutting wood. And so as he starts to use the razor to cut wood, he destroys the razor. And so if you don't know the purpose of a created thing, it can be destructive. It can be devastating. And so just like with the human person, you can have a scientist that can explore all the different elements, look under microscopes and study all the chemicals, the protons, the neutrons. We can look at the hormones of a human body. A doctor can tell you how the heart works, how it pumps blood through the body, and we can tell you how the organs work. And this is helpful. It can be helpful information, but scientists and doctors cannot just simply look at a human body and tell you what the God-given purpose of it is for. And if we don't know that, then we can cause detrimental harm to ourselves and to others. And so that's kind of going to be the thing he's going to focus on in the rest of this chapter. And as someone said in the comments during the week, that this reminded them of, I think the comment was made by Sherman, but how it reminded him of theology of the body. And that's exactly right. And that was exactly the church's point, and John Paul II's point about theology of the body, is that you really need to understand what we're for, to understand all the different aspects and elements of our life. And so what he also says is, then if you have a creature, you need to look at the creator to figure out what that thing is for. And so we need to go looking to God to find our ultimate purpose. And as Christians, we know that God has revealed to us why he created us and what the purpose is. But then she goes on to say that if a person doesn't know God's revelations, then he ends up he falls into a dilemma. It's possible for humans to look at each other and make observations about things, and they can try to guess what the purpose of human life is by observing, but most likely they're going to get it wrong. So most likely their observations are not going to tell them the true purpose, what God created us for. And he's going to spend a couple paragraphs talking about that. And so he's going to talk about how people can look at the human body and look at how we live and how we function and try to guess, okay, what's the ultimate purpose of a human person? Some people may say, well, it's to be as successful as I can, socially. It's to have the highest status possible, or it's to have as much money as possible. Or maybe it's if I had control over everything and every one of my life. Maybe that's what someone may think the purpose of life is for. Someone may even say, well, let's keep it simple. If I could laugh every day, then I'll be fulfilled. Frank, she just talks about how we can look around and see the things that make people motivated or happy, and we maybe can select one of those things as being the key purpose. But the problem is we're probably going to get it wrong if we're just guessing. If we really don't have access to God's revelation, we're going to probably get it wrong. And one of the things that he even said, he talks about how one of the things we see people even today falling into is thinking that ultimately what the purpose is to be, quote, happy. And to do that means fulfilling all my desires, my physical desires, emotional desires. It doesn't matter who gets, I'm not going to let anyone get in the way. It doesn't matter who I hurt. I'm just going to fulfill my desires. And if we think that that's the ultimate purpose, it can be devastating and destructive for ourselves and for others. And then the other thing he says is that even if we try to guess, and it's one of those things where he says we can still get it wrong if we're trying to guess, and we try to observe the way people live and the way people act and see if we can identify the purpose of life through that. He says we're still at the end of the day going to fall short, because what God shows us is that the purpose of our life is not anything natural. It's something supernatural. And so using our reason alone and using our observation and our intellect alone, we're going to never identify the ultimate purpose because it's something supernatural, which that word means above our nature. It's something that we're not going to be able to fully see with the vision of our human intellect without God, without God's assistance, without God's revelation. Oh, okay. Sorry. So these comments are just now coming through, so sorry about that. People are wanting to know the names of things and want me to hold up the whiteboard a little longer. There was a little bit of a delay in the comments. They all just now all of a sudden popped up at one time. So I will write the in the comments of dualism, then the Manichaeans. That was the group that St. Augustine, he kind of ventured around with them a little bit. Albigensians, and then the Cathars. There were others. These were just some of the groups with the dualistic views. All right, so all right, that was just a little intermission for me to catch up to some of the questions. So I put it in the little comment section what the names of some of those dualistic groups were. So what Sheet is going to tell us is that ultimately the purpose has to be something that we look to God for, and that we need His revelation, and we need Him to show us so that we can know exactly why He created us and what the ultimate purpose is. So then Frank Sheet says that if a person chooses to deny that God is real, or chooses to deny that God has revealed anything about who we are and the purpose of our life, then the only thing left is for that person just to decide for himself. And that kind of goes back to the things we just talked about, how as if a person rejects God or ignores revelation and just lives with himself, trying to define his life and the purpose, he's probably going to choose something far inferior to what God has created us for. And more often than not, because of who we are, and this is something we'll get to in a few more chapters, but we have a fallen human nature, which means that sin has caused us to have an intellect that's darkened. It's hard for us to know truth, and a will that's weakened. Even if we know truth, it's hard to follow it. And so he says that because of who we are as human beings, having this fallen human nature, if we reject God and don't listen to Him, then we're going to choose purposes far inferior and probably even harmful. And so one of the biggest things I think I see today in the world is just this idea of relativism, where people think that there is no truth, and all that I'm going to do is do whatever makes me happy and whatever feels right to me, and focusing on myself, kind of turning inward, being very selfish, having this kind of individualism, and that's very harmful. And I think over time, over the next few chapters, we'll get into this more about this idea of fallen nature and some of the issues with that. But I think Frank's going to talk about how this idea of not knowing God's given purpose is going to be nothing but disastrous for us as individuals, but also for our community, for the society and for the world. Then one of the things he says, before we talk about the philanthropist, because that's the next thing he's going to talk about, but right before he says that one of the issues that he has heard is that whenever he makes the comment that we need to listen to God and the God-given revelations about who we are and the purpose of our life, that people usually come back with two responses. People will tell him that either one, if I listen to God and let him tell me how to live my life, he's taking away my freedom, or I'm losing my freedom. That's one of the remarks that Rashid says. He says that sometimes I'll hear people tell me that if I say you need to listen to God and his purpose for you, they say that, well, I'm losing my freedom by listening to someone outside of me as to how I should live my life. What Frank Sheed says, this is completely erroneous. Because in reality, God's our creator. And if we achieve the purpose he created us for, that's the only way we're truly going to be free. If we become the person God made us to be, that is when we're going to be the most free. And then if we live any other way, we're simply enslaving ourselves. And it's like that razor with the man who has the beard. And the razor was made to shave his beard, but what he uses it is for chopping down trying to chop down a tree or to cut some wood. Ultimately, that razor's destroyed. So that razor becomes less free to do what it was meant to do if we abuse it or misuse it. And so that's how it is with us, that we become less free if we're not living and striving to fulfill that purpose God made us for, as we'll become less free. The only way we truly become free is to live, to be who God created us to be. And so that's what Frank Sheed will talk about in that section. And then he says that in reality, if we listen to God, he's our creator. He's not going to steer us wrong. He's going to tell us exactly what he made us for. And so there's no better person to listen to than the one who made us. Okay, then he's going to jump into the philanthropist question. And this was the question I posed during the week for discussion, is this idea about a philanthropist. This philanthropist rejects God, or he'll say, well, I don't really care about God, or I'm going to reject God. I don't need to know God. I don't need to know his revelation in order to be able to do good. So then the question is could a person who does not believe in God still do good things? So that's the question. And I think the way I would start in responding to that is, well, what do we mean by good? And what is good for men? What is good for human beings? Thomas Aquinas, in his Summa Theologia, he says that in order to truly, he's defining love, and he says true love is desiring what is good for the other person. So again, we have this idea of good. Frank Sheed says that you need to know God and his purpose for our life to be able to do good for others, or be able to decide what's good for others. And Thomas Aquinas will say in order to love someone, you need to desire what is good for them. So what is this idea of good? Well, Thomas Aquinas and Frank Sheed will see this idea of good the same way that God does and the same way that the church does. And so what is this ultimate good? We're going to be perfectly good whenever we achieve the purpose that God made us for. It's the same idea of being free. We're perfectly free. We'll be perfectly good, perfectly holy whenever we achieve what it is that God created us for. And what did God create us for? He created us for heaven. He created us to be in communion with him for all eternity. And so that's our ultimate purpose. And in chapter 3, we'll start to talk about heaven a little bit more. But our ultimate purpose is to be in communion with God. And that, because God is supreme goodness itself. So when we are in communion with goodness itself, God, then that's when we'll be perfectly good and perfectly free and perfectly holy and perfectly happy. And so he says that if we can desire that for the other, that's love. And Frank Sheet is saying the same thing in a sense that Aquinas did. Aquinas says if we desire that for the other, that's love. She will say the same thing, that if we desire the good for the other, which is heaven, that's love. But if the philanthropist doesn't know God, or he rejects God, he doesn't know that our ultimate purpose, the ultimate goodness that we should be striving for, is to be in heaven, then it's going to cause problems when the philanthropist has to make decisions on what is best for other human beings. Now, it doesn't mean that an atheist can't do something that's kind, but the trouble is the philanthropist doesn't know, or he's failing to know God, so he doesn't know that our ultimate goal is heaven. And so what he'll say is that the problem is that oftentimes this philanthropist in our example, but even people in our world today, if they neglect to see God and neglect to see what we're talking about, that heaven is our goal, then sometimes they'll look at the world and they'll see, okay, look, that man is suffering, and our goal in life should be to end suffering. That's what's going to make people happy, or it's good of me to end their suffering. That's what an atheistic philanthropist may say, is that what is good is if I end their suffering. And he says that's very dangerous, and we'll talk about why. But he says often people focus on the physical well-being of a person, looking at their physical suffering or their emotional suffering, and that's how they define what a good act is. So an atheist may be able to give money to the poor, or money to food to the homeless, because they think, oh, I need to try to do something to end their suffering. And that's a good thing. As Christians, we definitely want to end suffering, but that's not the ultimate end. But often an atheist will think that's the ultimate end, is to make people happy in this life or to end suffering in this life, and that's what they see as good. Okay, and so it's always moving when we see someone suffering, no doubt. And as Christians, it's a great act of kindness and charity to help people in their suffering. But what we also recognize as Christians is that suffering is not always the worst thing that can happen to somebody. In the Gospels, Jesus talks about how we need to not fear the one who can destroy the body, but fear the one who can destroy the soul. And so we recognize that there's even something bigger than just simply what we experience in this life. And so our ultimate goal and the ultimate good for a person is to make sure we keep that in mind, is that our ultimate desire is for heaven. And so all the decisions we make in this life, we do not want to impede that or be obstacles for us or another person to get to heaven. Let me just look at my outline really quick to make sure I'm not missing something. Okay, and so one of the things too that we have to think about in this same aspect, and Frank Sheet doesn't get into this, but I did want to just kind of mention this when it comes to this idea of having an atheistic philanthropist, and compared to in Christian worldview and Christian thought, is that as Christians, and the Catholic Church emphasizes this a lot, is that the ends can never justify the means. Okay, and so what that means, and this is supported in Scripture too. St. Paul talks about this in the book of Romans very briefly, but he kind of hints at it. But the ends cannot justify the means, which means that I can have a good intention and a good reason for doing something, but if what I have to do is evil to achieve that good, then it's evil. I can't do that. So maybe it'll help if I use my board again, my whiteboard. So the act, and then the end, and then there's also the intention. Okay, so whenever we're looking at moral, I don't want to get into morality too much. We may come back to this in another chapter, but you do something, like there's an action you're going to do, and then you have an end in mind you want to achieve, and you also have an intention. Abortion might be a good example to use. So let's say that the act you're going to do is abortion, which is killing the child in the mother's womb. And let's say your intention is that you want to, I don't really want to get into, a lot of the abortion discussions too much, but let's say you want to save the mother's life. So your intention is good. You want to save the mother's life, but the act to do that is to intentionally kill the child. Then the church would say that that act is evil, even though what you're trying to achieve to save the life of the mother is good. The act to do that is evil, so you can't do that. And that's what the church means for the ends cannot justify the means. The ends cannot justify what it is you're doing, no matter how good your intentions are. So the same thing with suffering. And I don't want to get into too much of the different dilemmas and scenarios with some of these moral issues. But I just want to basically say, like with suffering, we can want to end someone's suffering, which is a good thing. But if the way we go about doing it to achieve that is evil, then we cannot do it. And so euthanasia becomes a good example as well. So euthanasia is when someone intentionally kills a human person because for whatever reason, they want to end their life for whatever reason. You're intentionally killing them. Even if your intention is to end suffering, it's a good intention. You can't do something evil to achieve it. So the ends can never justify the means. But an atheist, this atheistic philanthropist who wants to do something good, they may look at a situation where you have a person with cancer who's suffering and they want to end their suffering, which is a good thing. But what they go about, the means they use to go about doing that is to kill the person. And it's like, oh, well, I've done a great good for the person. I've ended their life, so the suffering has ended. But you've murdered them. And so God would say that's evil. We can't do that. We don't have, as human beings, we don't have control over life. God is the one who is in control of life and death. So we leave it in his hands, and and when that person is suffering, let's say they have cancer, we need to be there and pray for them and support them and help the family, help the loved ones, do everything we can to make them be able to endure that suffering in various ways and comfort them, show them how much we love them. But the one thing we cannot do is to murder them, to end their life. But if you have an atheist who doesn't understand that suffering is not the worst thing that can happen to a person, the worst thing that can happen to a person is that you die and go to hell, and you're in hell for all eternity. Again, the thing that can destroy the soul is worse than what can destroy the body. But a philanthropist doesn't understand that. Not too long ago, I was in Canada, and whenever we were on this little tour, and the tour guide was talking about how Canadian law just made euthanasia legal. And so he was talking to the tour group about how his wife, who was a nurse, got to participate in the very first euthanasia case, and how him and his wife were so glad and honored to be a part of that. I mean, it was very disturbing, but him and his wife saw it as an act of honor to be able to participate in this euthanasia of this patient. And so again, that's what we're struggling with right now with this idea of this philanthropist, is if he doesn't recognize that there's worse things in the world than suffering, you're going to start to see a lot of devastation happening around you, where you have people feeling honored to participate in killing someone. So I don't want to kind of belabor this too much, but that's kind of what Frank Sheet is talking about with this philanthropist, is if you don't understand the purpose of life, it can be very destructive. Some other examples would be, in addition to euthanasia and abortion, would be, just think back about over the past 100 years. Think about Hitler and the Nazis and Stalin and communism in Russia and Mao and communism in China. Think about the devastation they caused because they did not know the purpose of human life. They didn't hesitate in executing millions and starving millions. They would do horrific scientific experiments on people because they did not see the value of every single human person. They saw people as kind of utilitarian when they were useful to their purpose, or they saw some people as less valuable than others. They could be discarded, or they would kind of focus on the common good, even if it meant killing some just intentionally, for whatever their political or economic purposes were. So whenever you lose sight of the human human value and the sacredness of human life and the purpose of our human life, the purpose of human life, then you can see how things can go terribly wrong. And I think that's what Frank Sheed is trying to emphasize, that without God and without his revelation and him showing us the purpose of human life, there's this slippery slope where people could start to think something is good when it's really evil and destructive and harmful. Hopefully that makes sense, hopefully. Definitely put in some comments along the sidebar if you have questions, if that's not making complete sense yet. But I see that like Jeremy is comparing the philanthropists like Bill and Melinda Gates to Mother Teresa, and definitely you can see in the world many examples of people who are contrasting visions of goodness. People who they can still do, like, let me get back to the atheists. They can still do things that what we would call are naturally good. So the church would say they can do things that are naturally good. So I can see someone who is starving and offer them food. I can see someone who is without money and needs clothing and shelter and give that to them. I don't have to know God to do those things. But the atheist who does those kind of things is not doing them with a supernatural love. That atheist is not doing them with the ultimate view, kind of the ultimate purpose of life in his view. And a lot of times atheists, whenever they do kind things and charitable things, they often have different motivations that have nothing to do with they definitely have nothing to do with heaven and what's best to help that person get to heaven, if that makes sense. So, and that's what we should all be thinking about, is whenever we choose to do things for other people, heaven is always kind of the focus. God, our relationship with God is the focus. What can I do every moment of my life to help myself draw closer to God and to help those around me draw closer to God? What can I do to help myself and my spouse and my friends and my family get to heaven? Because that's the ultimate good and the ultimate goal for our life. And if we're not thinking with that, then things can become very dangerous. Several people have talked about in the comments about, is Frank Sheed saying that if you have a philanthropist like an atheist who rejects God, are they simply living in a facade or living in an illusion? And Frank Sheed would say yes. I thought about this a lot, trying to come up with an analogy, and the best that I could come up would be this kind of idea. So growing up, my mom taught deaf children. So I was around deaf children and deaf teenagers some, and so I got to know them, and I was able to become a little bit more understanding of that disability and how it significantly impacts your life. And it definitely helped me to be able to appreciate the gift of hearing. But let's imagine. Let's compare this idea of this philanthropist who rejects God or doesn't believe in God to a deaf person who denies the fact that they're deaf or absolutely rejects the idea that they're deaf. And so then let's say we play different pieces of music for them, Mozart or Beethoven, or even just putting a rap song or something like that. We play that for them. If that person, can we look to that person who's deaf but who's refusing to see that and ask them, is this a beautiful piece of music? Now they can feel the vibrations for sure. They can feel the vibrations of the music, but can we ask them, is this to help me determine if this is a beautiful piece of music or not? The answer is no, because that person is deaf. They can hear vibrations, but they can't hear music as it is, as someone who can hear is able to hear that music. And so they can't see. If that deaf person was given the gift of hearing, they would be overwhelmed with the sound of Mozart, right? But if they were to think that those vibrations were truly music and were truly the definition of beautiful music, they would kind of be living in this illusion, living in this world that wasn't truly reality. So it's kind of like the philanthropist. So when the philanthropist is able to do good things, we as Christians can look at certain actions that they do, like giving to the homeless and giving to the poor, as things that are kind acts. They're generous, acts of generosity. But the philanthropist without God is almost like this deaf person who thinks that the vibrations are music and that's the best it gets. But what we come to realize with God and his revelations is that there's something higher and greater and better that God wants us to know. He wants us to really hear the music, in a sense, of the world and of life. And he wants us to truly achieve this good end, which is heaven, which is communion with him. And so he gives us this path on how to do it. And so if we're someone who rejects God, it's going to be very easy for us to fall away from the path or to not see the path at all. And though we can do kind things, we're never going to have the end of heaven, the goal of heaven in mind for anything that we do. And so it can lead to the atheist making decisions that are ultimately harmful, like abortion, like euthanasia, like communists and some of the things that they've done. So I don't know if that helps clear things up a little bit as far as like the illusion and the facade and what the points he's trying to make. And I hope I'm making that a little bit more clear as to what he was trying to say. Let me see. Let me look at some of the comments really quickly. So like Greg is talking about how, the communists and the Nazis, it was just a very disordered and dangerous situation. And that's absolutely right. And it's because Frank Sheed would say that they lost a sense for who man is and what man's purpose is. And so you can see just with them how dangerous it is. So there's a question, would the church consider the philanthropist act of virtue of charity? Not a supernatural virtue of charity. The supernatural virtue of charity is one that you do something for love of God and you love your neighbor because you love God. So love of God needs to be at the heart of supernatural acts of charity. But you can have the church, you can have natural virtues. So you can have people that can be kind and generous and not believe in God. But those things, when they do that, it's not a grace-filled action. That light behind my head's a little annoying. Sorry if that light behind my head's a little annoying. I just now noticed that. But so there are different, there's natural virtues and then supernatural virtues. The supernatural virtues are the ones that are fruits of us working with God's grace. But a philanthropist who's atheistic could do something kind and generous, but at the heart of it is not love of God. And so there would be a distinction, if that makes sense. Okay, and there's a couple other comments and things where people are talking amongst themselves, which is good. So I'm skimming back through some of the questions. So Paul talks about how he has, his brother's good and law abiding, but he simply believes we're light bulbs and just, I guess when this world is over, that's it. We're dead. There's nothing else. And that is sad, but there are a lot of people who do think that way, that at the end of this life, there's nothing else. Death is the end and we don't continue to exist and there's nothing more. And again, that's what many atheists believe and many people who don't have God's revelation believe. And throughout some of the comments this week, we've talked about it a lot, how God there's various ways that God has revealed himself to us. And in Romans chapter 1 and chapter 2, Paul talks about how God through creation has revealed himself to us. So even someone who doesn't have access to Jesus Christ can still know God. And God has put into our hearts a desire for him. He has put a desire for happiness and for goodness and for truth. And all those desires lead to God. And God has also put what the church calls the natural law into our hearts. And this law has some basic principles, do good and avoid evil. is an example. But if a person really, truly has no access to Jesus Christ, but can observe the world around them and really ponders their heart and looks deep into their heart, God has given them access to at least begin to know this map of life that Frank Sheet's talking about. They won't be able to know it to the same degree and depth that Christians can know it, but God has not abandoned people. Like someone was giving the example earlier in one of the discussion questions about a man on a mountain who's never encountered other human beings or never encountered Christian missionaries. He can know God. God has not abandoned that person. So just like all the atheists who are rejecting God, they still too have this desire for God in their heart. They still have this natural law that God asks them to follow. And so if these people who don't have access to Christianity can recognize there's a creator and seek to love the creator and to know the creator, and they seek to follow the plan as far as they know it, the life that God has for their life, then God is going to continue to help them and offer them his graces in various ways. And so, but people who don't listen to that, people who refuse to listen to the depths of their heart where God is trying to speak to them, people who don't look at creation and see that God is showing us himself through that, then many people do begin to become more and more blinded to truth. And so they can become like what Paul is talking about, how they think that everything's about this world and that's it. And it's a dangerous situation because they will start to look more, they'll fail to see the purpose for human life. And so their actions, their decisions, their choices will have nothing to do with God. They'll have nothing to do with heaven. They'll have nothing to do with that purpose of life that God has revealed to us. And so sometimes they can become like that man with the razor, and they'll treat human life like that razor, and they'll misuse it and abuse it, and it's very dangerous. But that's why it's important to evangelize and do what we can, and at a minimum, pray for other people, that they'll come to know God and his truth and what he's revealed to us. Anyways, I'm kind of going off a little bit on a tangent, kind of talking too much about that point, but hopefully that idea of the philanthropist and the point that Frank Sheet is trying to make, that an atheist, someone who rejects God, is living in an illusion. They can do kind things, but they still do not have man's ultimate purpose and his ultimate goal in mind. And so eventually they can be very harmful to people because they may think something is good when it's actually incredibly harmful. And the final point, going back to this idea of suffering, is that what God has revealed to us is that suffering can be redemptive. Suffering is something that when we unite ourselves to Christ through our suffering, then that suffering can be a part of our sanctification, can be a part of that process of making us holy as we draw closer to Christ through our suffering. And that's a great thing. No one looks forward to suffering. But if we unite our suffering with Christ's, then it can be very fruitful. And so people who like the atheistic philanthropist don't realize that. And so if they are thinking they're doing something good for the person who's dying with cancer, and they participate in this act of euthanasia and kill the person, well, they haven't necessarily done a good thing for that person, because that suffering that person was experiencing is a part of God's plan and providence, and we may not understand it on this side of heaven, but once we get to heaven, God's going to show us why things happened and the plan and purpose he had for our life and how that played out. But that person who's suffering needs to, growing up, I always kind of heard offer it up, because what that means is we offer it up in union with Christ, so that our suffering can be united with his, and can be part of that process of making us holy and part of the sanctification process. Does that make sense? Hopefully. I'm not seeing a lot of comments. I don't know. Hopefully it doesn't mean that I cut off or anything, but hopefully that makes sense. So just to kind of conclude that the last part of the chapter, he just tells us that, this first chapter, and he'll reiterate it in almost every chapter for the next several chapters, is that the purpose of man's life is revealed by God, and the purpose of man's life is what he wants to really be at the heart of this book. He wants to draw this map for us But this map is something that Frank Sheet didn't create. It's something that God created. It's a God-created map, and he just wants to describe it and show it to us. And at the very end of the map is our purpose. It's what we're aiming for. It's the goal. It's our God-given goal. And so he wants to show us in the next several chapters what that goal is and how we achieve it. But he first wanted to, in this chapter 1, he really wanted to first start by emphasizing why it's so important to know that purpose, and how without God, we can fall short of knowing the purpose, even to the point of that becoming destructive or detrimental to ourselves and to others if we think that we can do good for others without God at the heart of all of our decisions and at the heart of our life. Okay, so I'll stop with that, and then hopefully if there's some comments and things, people can add those in and I can respond to any kind of questions maybe. Definitely. So one person's suffering can become a testimony to other people. Absolutely. And especially for Christians, think about the early martyrs in the first few hundred years. There were so many converts to Christianity because people saw the love and the joy on the faces of martyrs. I remember, you can read some stories about this. There's a writing called The Martyrdom of Polycarp. And in that, it talks about how even in the midst of they're trying to burn him alive, they end up having to kill him with a knife because he doesn't die. But they see the joy on his face, and it moves the witnesses, the people who are watching this. It moves them to say, what is this faith that he has that makes him even joyful in death, even joyful in the midst of suffering? And the reason Christians, we can be so joyful in suffering is because what joy is knowing you're loved unconditionally, and you don't lose that in suffering. So suffering does cause pain. It can be a burden. It can be hard for us to endure it, but with God's grace, he'll help us endure it. But we can always be joyful. We may not have a smile on our face. Joy doesn't mean necessarily having a smile and laughing. Joy means knowing that deep down in your heart, you're loved unconditionally by God, and he never stops loving you. And so the martyrs in the early church had that. They knew that. And so they could sometimes sing. You hear stories about how they were in the arena whenever they would put the Christians in there, either throw them to the animals or they would put them on stakes and burn them alive. The Christians would sing together or pray together and still be joyful. And so a lot of the pagans, a lot of the Romans watching were just moved by this. And you can read stories. Many people were converted by that. And so, yes, the one person's suffering can be a testimony to God and to the fact that we know as Christians that suffering is not the worst thing that can happen to us. And definitely just the comment about how it's important for children to learn suffering, and that's true. I think it's an important lesson, that hopefully Christians are giving to their children, is that teaching people how to suffer with joy and how to understand that suffering is inevitable. It's a part of this life, but it's how we respond to that. And suffering can make us holy if we can endure that and unite it to Christ. It can make us holy. Can you repost? So then there's a comment about repost. Let's see, a correlation of the catechism in this book. So every week I'll try. So he doesn't exactly follow the catechism, but every week I'll try to link his key points with some things in the catechism. And hopefully most people know this. So the Catechism of the Catholic Church, it's a very large book, but you can access it online, and I'll post those. But it's a very beautiful book, and it's great to read. And so I'll link portions of the catechism to his key points as often as I can. So if you scroll back through the group page, you can probably find week 1. But yeah, if you want me to repost those links to week 1, I can do that. And then for week 2, in chapter 2, he's going to talk about the purpose of the law. It's a really good chapter as well. I think it's a little difficult in some ways just because of his writing style. But I think after you get past chapter 1 and chapter 2, the book does, hopefully, I'm hoping, it'll start to get a little easier as you get used to how he writes. But chapter 2 is difficult at times, but the point of chapter 2 is he's going to be showing us what the purpose of the law is. It's a great chapter with a great message, and it's important. So I'll repost. I'll post some of the catechism links to that, where the catechism is talking about the moral law, the 10 Commandments, the natural law, other things like that. So I'll repost some of those things too. I can put that in the comments to this video. Oh yeah, there you go. People are linking it up. Thank you. People are putting in the comments. So yeah, so someone just posted week 2's catechism links, and then we can go back and post week 1's catechism links again. Either someone can do that, or I can do that in a minute. Or that I posted earlier last week. So, all right, other questions? I feel like sometimes it's kind of hard whenever I stand and stare at the screen. My face is right there, so it's kind of weird, and sometimes it makes me a little distracted. So I think I'm sometimes babbling. So hopefully that's not the case. I just sometimes get distracted. I get distracted just staring at my face. All right, any more questions or comments or anything like that? All right, well, thank you. All right, thanks, Mimi. Okay, well, thanks again for doing this, and I hope that everyone will stick with it. I really hope and pray. I pray so hard that this is going to be fruitful. This book was just very inspiring to me. I can remember the first time I read it and how I felt after I finished. It was just eye-opening, and I just think he makes points that a lot of them are things we know, but he's presenting them in a slightly different way that it makes them a little more enlightening, a little bit more moving. I hope so. I'm hoping that by the end of the book, everyone will understand more as to why I picked it and why I chose it. Okay, good. Glad I'm not babbling. Okay, so for next week, we'll read chapter 2. Be patient with it. I'm going to post a discussion thing on Tuesday, and it's a quote from one of Frank Sheed's other books that I absolutely love. So I hope that you'll take a pause on Tuesday from your reading to read the quote that I'm going to post, because this quote really summarizes what this chapter 2 is about, and it's awesome. So hopefully you'll take a pause in your reading to read my quote that I'll post on Tuesday. It's my discussion question post. And then throughout the week, if you're having trouble or difficulties, there's a paragraph you just can't get, post comments, post questions. I don't know if I'm going to do that chat thing again. That was the first time I tried it. I just said, oh, that'll be interesting, clicked on it, and then it was a little weird. I know everyone all of a sudden started to get their phones lighting up with people as I started that chat. So if you like the chat, let me know. We can redo that as well as a forum for questions. But otherwise, if you would rather not, I can just post the comments like we've been doing, have a post with a discussion question. But definitely ask questions as we go along. And thanks to everyone who's been kind of commenting as we go. And hopefully more people will start jumping in. Don't be afraid if you have a question or have a point or a comment, please feel free to throw that out there. I just want all of us to be able to learn from each other. So let me check and make sure there's no more questions, and then let's see. Oh, here, let me read this really quickly. So Joanne says, okay, well, good. That's a great story, Joanna. Thank you. Yeah. As we go along, though, we're going to some of his chapters down the road. We'll talk a little bit about elements like what happens after life, and so I'll go into that a little bit more as we get there. What our goal is, and he'll talk a little about heaven and hell, and he'll talk a lot about the path in this life, what God, the different things God has given us in this life to be able to achieve our purpose, but what also happens if we fail to achieve our purpose. So Christina is adding that Frank Sheed is Irish and went into England after World War I. So I don't know if in the first video I talked much about it, but yeah, Frank Sheed and his wife did live in London for quite a while. I don't know if they ever came to America. I have to double check that. But one of the things that Frank and his wife are known for is evangelization. So they were street preachers. And so they would get out and talk to people as they would pass by about the faith. Now, they weren't proselytizing and standing telling people, that they're going to go to hell or anything. But what they would do is try to engage people. And almost what I know some people who are on this group are parts of St. Paul Street Evangelization. So it's similar as to what St. Paul does, St. Paul Street Evangelization does. But he had, back in the 1920s and 1930s, he had a huge group of people that would stand and go to different places and teach. And they would stand and engage people and talk to people as they went by. And so he even talks about in his books how a lot of this is the fruits of him talking to people and seeing what it was that people didn't quite understand, or having these conversations helped him to be able to come up with analogies and explanations to try to explain the faith better. So I know that's part of his background, and he has a ton of books. Let me see. But anyway, he has a lot of books and about different topics. But yeah, at first it takes some getting used to when you read him, because it's from 1933. But also he has he's the Irish English background, and that's a part of it too. All right. All right. Well, so I'll conclude with that. I know I've taken up a lot of your time. So thanks again for watching. And if you have questions, post it throughout the week. Please join in the discussions and add your comments and questions as much as you can. Like I said, I just really hope that we can all learn from each other. And sometimes asking questions is the best way to learn and to understand something better. But sometime next Sunday, we'll do a similar type of format with just explaining chapter 2 and going over it again. Right now, it's tentatively around 4 p.m. unless something comes up. I'm going to give it a day or two to check my schedule, but just watch the group page and I'll confirm that. But right now, that's what I'm looking at is next Sunday around 4. So until then, if you have questions, let me know. But otherwise, hopefully you have a good week. And thanks again for your support and joining in with this and reading along. And hopefully this will be fruitful and something that'll bring everybody closer to Christ. All right. Have a good night. God bless you.